Welcome to today's Light and Darkness reading. Chapter 25, Supplies. It was well known that Dachmann would soon launch another attack, more carefully this time. Every day that passed, it was certain that they were preparing. Lord Bonson wondered if it would be better to take the fight to them, but Alva said this would waste unnecessary men. Hellel agreed. Alva's perspective was that it was better to keep the men training and ready. Brach would be hard to surprise a second time with trickery, but he would be in for quite a shock if he underestimated the Lacinian army. Unfortunately, after his rout by the Lacinian cavalry and archers, his underestimating them a second time did not seem very likely. The Lacinian forces would need to keep them close to the entrance of the pass, otherwise the size of the Dachmonian force would surround or overwhelm them. There was great comfort in the fact that Hope's light could neutralize the terror of the Dachmanim, but this did not change the harsh reality of Dachmann's numerical superiority. As the days wore on, and the luster of the first victory began to wear off, Alva and his generals had to be creative in keeping up morale. Alva and Bonson would have a daily sword practice together. In the afternoon, many of the men would gather to watch them sword fight for about 20 minutes. Their skill created quite a stir and drew many cheers. It also kept both men's skills sharpened, because few others could present a real challenge for either of them. Very seldom was either of their guard broken because they were fighting for practice rather than victory. 5 days after Bonson's charge, a train of supply wagons arrived from Brescia. Balsasanar oversaw these supply trains himself, as well as making enormous financial contributions to them. He had told Alva that he was not much good in a fight, but would do all he could to make the fight successful. This would be a good day for the army because fresh food was coming, including fresh steak and a replenishment of the ale supply. Spirits were high. When the wagons arrived at mid-morning, there was another surprise for Bonson, though he was not present to greet it. Sal was with his friend Balsasanar on the front wagon, and his daughter was with him. Bonson was out with Lord Dieron leading the cavalry in drills and would not return until the afternoon. Salia looked around without seeing him. She desperately wanted to ask after him, but she would not let herself do so, thinking that it might get back to him. She planned to act as indifferent about him as possible and let him seek her out if he wanted to. She had heard about his exploits and wondered if he had thought about her at all since they had last seen one another. If he hadn't, she determined within herself that she was not going to let herself be heartbroken. Somewhere deep down she knew she was kidding herself. Alva and Hope were both there to greet the wagons. Alva immediately began to discuss pragmatic issues with the mayor and Sal, while Hope greeted Salia with a big hug. "I've missed you," Hope said. "That's so sweet of you. I don't know what there is to miss." "I don't have any other girls to talk to. Except Nira, of course, but I don't know. I've missed you." "It's nice to see you again," Salia said with a smile. "Lord Bonson will be here later this afternoon, too," Hope said. Then, half embarrassed, half annoyed, the half embarrassed, half annoyed change in Salia's countenance made her wonder if she had said the wrong thing again. "It will be good to see him, too," Salia replied. "What about Prior and Pensor? And Lord Dieron, of course. I really miss seeing all of them." "They're off training somewhere or other. They'll be along, too," Hope replied. Is Lord Diron a married man? Asked Salia. He's rather handsome. I believe he is, Hope replied. Oh well. He looks a little too much like Alva for my taste anyway. No offense, of course. Salia said this with a playful laugh. None taken, Hope said, and they both laughed. Hope was glad Salia gave her an easy way to remove her foot from her mouth. As the supplies were distributed, Sal helped Philor plan to prepare a fine meal of steak for the men that night. Hope showed Salia around the camp while they talked about one thing and another. Salia received many smiles that made her feel confident in herself. The men would not dare smile at Hope in the same way, knowing that she was Alva's fiancée, but most of the men did not know of this girl's connection with Lord Bonson. In the early afternoon, Bonson returned from his drills. He had heard that Salia had come with the supply train and, unlike her, wasted no time in seeking her out. She and Hope had gone to the kitchen to help Sal and Philor. Salia was kneading dough to bake rolls and had flour all over her hands and apron. Hope had finished preparing a salad and was listening to a conversation Alva was having with Balsasar. Lots of off-duty soldiers were milling around here and there, resting from morning practice and conversing about one thing and another. Many of them shot periodic glances at Salia and tried to catch her eye. She seemed absorbed in her kneading, however. It was a good distraction to keep her from dwelling on what would happen when she saw Bonson. He had said a lot to her without saying much, and she was quite anxious to know what he would or would not say today. Lord Bonson walked up behind her, making no attempt to be quiet. He had all the confidence of his younger days, though not all of the arrogance. Hearing his firm footsteps, which she recognized, gave her a moment to reflect on her reaction. She did not let on that she knew he was there, but rather continued with her kneading. He addressed her from behind. "Good afternoon, Salia." She turned around, hands and apron covered in flour, and gave her most indifferent smile, and said, "Oh, hello, Lord Bonson. How nice to see you again." "I'm very glad to see you too," he said with his most charming smile. "I came to see you as soon as I could." "Oh, that's sweet of you," she said in the same tone. "I heard you won quite a victory. Congratulations." By this time they were beginning to attract the attention of the surrounding men. Bonson was speaking in a very audible tone. Hope was very interested in the scene, but watched without watching. Alva watched, but did not bother to try to look like he was not watching. Neither did the mayor or Salia's father. "Well, a lot of us were involved in that," he replied, "but thank you. And have you given any thought to what we last spoke about?" "You'll have to refresh my memory about what we were talking about." "We were discussing," Bonson said, making no attempt to be quiet, "what I might have to do for you to be willing to marry me." "Oh, is that what you are getting at?" It seemed a little ambiguous. "I thought you didn't remember the conversation," he said with a smile that had lost none of its confidence. "Well, it's sort of coming back," she said. "Well, to the point," he said, "seeing that I'm not being ambiguous now. Are you going to marry me?" I guess I should put it this way. Will you marry me?" Salia stood for a few moments. She was beginning to blush at this very public scene. Finally she said, "Well, I can't think of anything clever to say, so yes." The moment she said yes, he reached out, picked her up so that her head was level with his, and kissed her. All the soldiers standing around cheered wildly. Salia had never been picked up before. Though very pretty, she had always been self-conscious about her plumpness, but her new fiancé didn't seem to notice that she weighed anything at all. She had also never been kissed before. When he put her down after several seconds, she was flushed and breathless, but not unhappy. The men were still cheering. She was very embarrassed, but Salia had always enjoyed attention, and could not have honestly said that she was not enjoying herself. As the cheers died down, Alva looked at Bonson in amused surprise. "Sorry, Alva," Bonson said. "I'm not as patient as you are." "Huh," Alva said. "Nice work." "You're a little too patient anyway," Hope said teasingly to Alva. "He doesn't have Nera to deal with," Alva replied. "Salia's father has a wicked right hand, though," Bonson said, looking at Sal, who had been watching the whole scene. "I guess it's all right as long as you're getting married," Sal said. "Just watch out when she starts throwing plates." "It's the wine glasses I'm worried about," Bonson laughed. "You know, I can still change my mind," Salia said. Bonson picked her up and kissed her again. When he put her down, and she had caught her breath a second time, she said, "Well, maybe I won't change my mind, but I'm going to make sure we have lots of wine glasses around on every shelf and table." "Nothing like a girl who keeps you on your toes," Bonson laughed. Then turning to Alva, he asked, "Did your father ever say that?" "Well, he would have if he'd thought of it," Alva replied. That night there was a wonderful feast for the men, and Bonson and Salia's engagement was announced publicly, though most of the men had heard about it by that time. Spirits in the camp were high. It had been a good day. Chapter 26. Preparing for the second dance. General Broch had one great difficulty before his next attack, one that had bought Alva a good deal of time while his ranks continued to expand with new volunteers from around the gigantic Lacinian Valley. Broch's problem was how to attack in force when Alva had opened a chasm between the two armies. It would be easy for Alva to repel a division of leaping horses, which he would be able to see coming from far away. Whatever powers the Dachmanim had, they could not produce light to blind their enemies as Hope had done. Their business was darkness. The obvious answer was for the chasm to be filled in, but this would take some time, and Broch knew well that the Lacinian archers could pick off working men, while the Lacinian catapults could dismantle carts carrying earth, rocks, and rubbish before the carts got there. Broch was not dismayed, however. Alva was the only general who had ever defeated him in battle, and he had decimated the best of his cavalry in the process. Broch would have his revenge. He also knew that if he did not have some success soon, then the Dachmanan would take some revenge of his own. The thought of what the Dachmanan would do with a servant who had failed him was terrifying. While Broch's army had seldom encountered a serious challenge, it was always prepared for an attack on a city with a moat. This meant there was a healthy supply of filler materials, largely composed of rubbish retained from cities and towns that Dachman had destroyed. Of course, they did not have near enough for the chasm that had been opened by Alva and Hope, but he immediately gave orders that more be brought through the pass. One of the special units of his army were the Giants of Abassaron. The men of this land were not giants in a mythological sense, like giants in storybooks that are 10 times as tall as a regular man. They were called giants because they grew to be very tall and large. Prior the Mighty would have been considered a small Abassarian if he had lived in that land. The Abassarians were a fierce and brutal people far in the west, even farther than Dachman. They had been conquered during Dahman's western expansion. Because they were a kingdom founded on power and violence themselves, the Abessarians assimilated well into the Dahmonian force. The power of the Dahmanim had long kept them from being needed in major combat, but the conquest of Lassania would be a different story. Brach would not use his giants in his first attack. He had learned his lesson about starting with his best weapons. He would save them until the Lassanian army was at a weak point and the giants could plow them down. However, he would use them to fill the chasm. The large carts that carried the rubbish were fitted with large steel plates in front to repel arrows and other projectiles. The giants would push these carts from behind, and should the front plates be hit by catapult rocks, they would usually have the strength to stand their ground and keep the cart from tipping. This was tedious work. The cleverness and skill of the Lassanian archers found ways to take down many Abessarians, and the catapults did succeed in wrecking many carts. But gradually, the chasm began to be filled, and the time when the Dahmonian Hurin forces could cross it grew closer every day. The drawback of Brach's solution was that it gave the Lassanians a chance to see the giants before they would be used in battle, and to think about how they might combat them. To bolster the men against any fear they might not be able to stand against the giants, Prior often told the story of the way Alva had manhandled him the day they met. In addition to being encouraging, this story had a healthy dose of humor to keep the men laughing. Periodically, the men would be heard around the camp saying, "Maybe we can put him over a pack horse," or, "Depends. Are we talking about a scrap or a pie-eating contest?" The stories of Alva's duels with Glandair and Bonson were also circulated quite a bit. The duel with Glandair was particularly encouraging because it had been a duel with real swords and a fight to the death, even though Alva had let Glandair live. Prior and the others would often remind the men that it was Alva primarily who had trained them with the sword, and their skill as his followers would be more than a match for men of any size. Prior himself was anxious for a fight with these giants. He had not fought a man larger than himself for many season changes, and it was an exciting challenge. Glandair and his mighty warriors were also excited at the prospect of crossing swords and axes with these giants. They were fully convinced that they were the best fighting unit in Alva's army, and they were anxious to prove it. It was well known that by almost any reasoning, the Lassanians were hopelessly outnumbered. They would face the combined weight of the armies of Dahman and Hurin, both of which were large and mighty. Warriors from many conquered lands would be employed against them, and Lassania's only supply of men came from within her own borders, vast though the valley was. Alva and his generals were thankful for the fact that the Camden Pass was narrow enough that their men could not see the size of the invading army, and that they could channel them so long as they could keep the fight close to the pass itself. The magnitude of the army would be disheartening. If the odds ever came up in a meeting of the generals, Alva would remind them that they all knew the odds when they started, and that it was what they signed up for. To surrender to Dahman would be no better than losing to them. Not only were they evil, but they wanted revenge on Lassania for their defeat in the days of Daivan the Great. They would not show mercy for any reason. Alva kept a strong and positive outlook, but of course the future gnawed at him. He often remembered Hellel saying that perhaps things were easier for a soldier than a king. True as that may be, it certainly was not easy to lead men into what seemed like certain death. But of course, life under Dahman would be living death, so fighting was the only real option. And there was hope. In the last season change, Alva had learned that there was such a thing as real magic, and his beautiful young fiancée was full of it. Grit and iron could only go so far, but there was no telling what the power of hope could do when fully put to the test, and she would give every bit of herself to protect the people. As Alva mused on these things one night, he had a terrible thought, the thought of Hope dying. Dachmon had been trying to kill her since Alva had met her. This made him boil with anger and wish he had a Dachmonian host present on which to vent his rage. But his rage soon subsided into a smile. The day they met re-entered his mind. He remembered his first words. Lady Hope, my pleasure. Your name means his own? How little they had both known then about the way they would change one another's lives. What was Hellel thinking in postponing their marriage? Would they be able to marry before they died? Alva had given up on marriage and children such a long time ago, but now he desperately wanted to meet and raise the children Hope had sung into his dreams after he had been killed by the Dark Warrior, or had killed the Dark Warrior at the Dry Lake. He loved her so much, and everything seemed to be in the way of them having just a peaceful, married life. They spent as much time together as they could, but would they ever really be together? As Alva mused on these various thoughts one day, he saw a great cloud of dust in the distance to the east. He knew what it meant. A large group of men was coming from that direction. Volunteers continued to join the army every day, but this was the largest group yet. While they would not have time to be trained to Alva's satisfaction, they would be valuable reinforcements when Alva's current troops got into trouble. One more rock in the path of Dachmon's success. Alva rode out to meet them, and riding at the lead was Philon the Fourth. Lord Alva, he called out in greeting. Alva quickly rode forward, dismounted, and kneeled, and said, Your Majesty, in greeting. Please rise, Lord Alva, Philon said. Alva rose, mounted his horse, and the two rode back into the camp side by side. May I have a private word? Philon asked. I am yours to command, Alva said. With one proviso, Philon said. Yes, Alva said, looking him straight in the eye. You need not fear, Lord Alva, Philon said. I will honor what has been agreed. They entered Alva's tent. Alva offered the king wine, which he declined, and they sat down. They stared at one another for some time, until at last Philon spoke. I know. You believe my father was wrong to make the Great Peace. Forgive me for using that name. I cannot use the one you prefer. My father discussed this with me for long hours. He was never at peace about his decision, but he did what he felt he must. Perhaps he was wrong, perhaps not. Tyagon was my king for many, many years, and I was proud to have him as king. He agreed with you and Hellel that a peaceful solution cannot be found with Dachmon. So the chess pieces are set in such a way that I cannot do what my father did, though the odds are much more strongly against us. Alva nodded. He was impatient to know where this was going, but he did not show it. He was somewhat uncomfortable around Philon, especially discussing the subjects the king had mentioned. If my father made a mistake, if he did, I think it was because he was in Grenvir while your father led the army. Perhaps he did not understand the situation. Perhaps he did not fully understand the war from a distance. At Tyagon's insistence, I am king. But this is a war I cannot stop. So I have gathered as many men as I could, with the help of the lords who had not already joined you, so that I could come here and stand with you, and see for myself what we are fighting for. I am afraid to fight, Lord Alva, But should we lose, I will have no kingdom to rule. I am not a military man, so you will have to tell me where I fit in the army." When he had finished, Philon breathed a sigh of relief. If Alva was uncomfortable in Philon's presence, Philon was somewhat frightened in his. Alva looked at him thoughtfully for a long time. At length he smiled. "You are the heir of Philon. Therefore you are the heir of Divan, and I am the only living Danae. It's about time we had a private conversation. Now we haven't even missed one generation." Philon smiled as well now. "Lord Hellel and I have learned to agree to disagree about the Hurin-Lacinian War," Alva continued. "I am loath to admit there was any doubt about the right decision there, but Hellel is one of the greatest men I have ever known. The important thing is that we agree about Dachman. I believe my father would say that old things are over and we must move on. You and I will soon be family, assuming that I live that long. I will not give up the possibility that victory will be achieved, and if it is, the heir of Divan must rule in Lacinia. So I would have you wait to engage in battle as long as possible. Lord Hellel is my head counselor, and I would have you keep his company until that time." "Are you afraid, Lord Alva?" "Of dying? No. Of what will happen if we lose? Yes." "But you truly believe it is better to fight even though losing is such a real possibility?" "No, Your Majesty. I believe it is better to fight even though losing is a strong probability." "I must confess that is hard for me to understand." "You did the right thing in coming here. I believe that before all is done, you will understand." "There's one more thing, Lord Alva." "Yes?" "There is something that has been gnawing at my conscience. I must tell you. Last season change, it was I who told the Dachmonian ambassador about Hope. They pursued you because I told him that she existed. I even told him her name." Alva was silent at first. He did not look angry, but thoughtful. "Was he accompanied by one of the Dachmanim?" he asked. "Yes. He stared at me, and I could not help answering the ambassador's questions. Since her birth, I had never told anyone about Hope's existence. I did not know where she was, and made no attempt to see her in case I would reveal the secret. But when he asked about my brother, his wife, and their child, I told him everything I knew." "Thank you for telling me this. I'm glad you don't have to carry it anymore." "Are you angry?" "No, Your Majesty. After what happened at the Dry Lake, I no longer feel the fear of the Dachmanim, but I remember it. I saw one of the greatest warriors I have ever known, let me rephrase that. I saw some of the greatest warriors I have ever known fling themselves on the ground in terror before only one of these men. But Hope is alive, and I am alive, and my friends are alive. I am content. I believe it took great courage to tell me this, and I am glad that my king is a man of courage." "Lord Danae," Philon said, "my father was a man of courage." "I accept that," Alva replied. "Lord Hellel has explained this to me. It was hard to accept, but I see that what he did took courage, though I may think he was wrong. I am glad to see that you are like him in this. You doubted that I was a man of courage? Yes. Forgive me. I forgive you. So did I. Alright, friends, that's it for today. Tomorrow, I hope your appetite is whet for some fighting.